Greetings and salutations. Thank you for clicking on this video. This is an EzeeLinux Q&A video, and this is episode 10. In these sorts of videos, I take a look at some of the comments and questions that I have gotten recently and answer those questions in the video for the benefit of those who may be wondering the same thing. The first question that we have came in an email, and it is from Rajko. And he says, "Hi, I'm going to soon buy a Dell laptop with Ubuntu 14.04 on it. Should I reinstall it and make partition itself or not? If I do, how large the boot partition should be, 512 or 1 gigabyte, and Ext4 format." And yeah, it's a little bit broken, but don't worry, I understand what you're trying to say here, Rajko, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly as well. Okay, so let's take the first part. He says he's going to buy a new laptop that has Ubuntu pre-installed, and he wants to know, should he reinstall it? If I was going to buy a computer that came with Ubuntu installed on it, I would probably just leave it alone and use it as is. And that is because I know for a fact that Dell and System 76 and maybe even HP, they do a little bit of tweaking to make sure that the Ubuntu installation runs smoothly on the hardware that they're selling you. That's not unusual at all, and so if you would just go willy-nilly reinstalling things, you may lose some of those tweaks, and you might end up with a situation where you don't get exactly the right drivers, which would compromise the performance of the hardware. System 76 sells computers that have Ubuntu on it, and they do tweak it a bit. They add their own drivers and a few other things to make it work. However, they do have a path that you can take to install whatever distribution you want on it, and their tech support department will actually help you do that. I don't know whether Dell will or not. It may void your tech support agreement if you would reinstall with another system. So even if I bought a System 76 computer, I would probably go ahead and use Ubuntu for a while to see how well it worked. There's really not that huge of a difference between Ubuntu and Linux Mint, and I know for a fact I can make it work, so I would just go ahead and do that. If I bought a machine, I'm pretty sure that I would actually use the installed system for a while just to see how it went, and then I would look into reinstalling. So that's the answer to your first question. If you're going to buy it pre-installed, don't fix what ain't broken and just leave it alone. And the second part here talks about creating a boot partition. I'm going to get a little deeper into partitions a little later in this video, and I will answer that question more fully when we get to that part. But for now, I'm going to just say that yes, you can create a separate boot partition, and I have posted videos where I showed you how to do that. I went through a period in time where I was installing systems that way, and after a while I kind of realized that it was more trouble than it was worth. There are a couple of downsides to doing that. First of all, if you have like 512 megabytes in your boot partition, and then you're using Ubuntu, for instance, which every time a new revision of the kernel comes out, it installs it automatically, you may run into a situation, if you are not being diligent and removing old kernels, where the system will not have enough space to put the new kernel into the boot partition. And I really don't like the idea of having to set aside an entire gigabyte of space on a drive just for boot either. It seems to be a bit of a waste. The kernel itself is only about 250 megabytes. So if you want to ride herd on it and do that, yeah, there is a tiny performance. You get a little bit more performance at boot time because it doesn't have to search through a larger file system to find the kernel, but at the same time, it's really not worth it. I mean, so I don't even do that anymore. You can do whatever you want to, and I'm going to talk more about that as we roll along. So just to wrap up and sum up what I was saying, you know, for your comment here, Rajko, if you're going to buy the machine, I just use it as it came and get to know it real well, and then later on look at reinstalling should you want to do something else. This is a comment that came in an email that had a whole lot of different points in it, and I have just excised this one point here because I think it's something that does need to be talked about. This is from a fellow named Joe, And he says, I'm looking at full Linux distributions where I can install what I need. But these distributions are full of all kinds of middleware that's unnecessary. What's worse is I've tried removing programs like Bracero, Epiphany, Evolution, and a bunch of other nonsense, and they always seem to hard link to system component dependencies that get removed when you uninstall the app normally, and then it breaks the OS. Okay, so there's a lot here to cover. First of all, when you talk about a full Linux distribution, you are actually talking about an installation that will probably take up less than 6 gigabytes. So while it may appear to somebody looking from the outside that the system has a lot of unnecessary or middleware, as he calls it, or bloatware or whatever, it's actually not that much. It's very small. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that with Linux, you can have pretty much as much software installed on the system as you like, and it is not going to represent a performance hit. Whereas if you're coming from Windows, Windows has a central registry. And so every time you install a piece of software, it creates an entry in that registry, and it creates registry keys for that piece of software. And as it runs, it generates more and more of these registry keys. And so every time that a Windows system wants to open a piece of software or do anything, it has to parse through this great big text file that is the registry. And that slows the system down. Also, Windows tends to leave a lot of garbage in the registry. It creates stuff and just leaves it there. So these registries can get really huge. And so therefore, this is why one of the reasons that when you install Windows, you might do a fresh install and everything's nice and zippy. And then over time, you notice that the system just keeps slowing down. It's all of the junk that the Windows operating system is throwing in there. Linux doesn't do that. Linux creates log files. There are some caches, but it doesn't slow the system down. It's just a completely different way of running the system. And so if you install a piece of software on Linux, yes, it goes out and it gets dependencies and it installs them, but once they're installed and once that is set, it doesn't have to look through that every time it opens up the software. The application itself is what calls on the dependencies, so that's taken care of within the application. It's not a system-wide function. And so therefore, you can have a lot of software on a Linux machine and it's not going to run terribly slow compared to a Linux system that's very stripped down. Also, in Linux and Unix, Linux is modeled after Unix. The Unix philosophy of computing is to take a complex job and divide it up into lots of little jobs. And it is perfectly okay to have interdependencies. That's the way this system works. And this is how programs are written in Unix and Linux. It's perfectly okay for somebody to come along with an idea and then say, okay, well, I need this little piece of software, I need this particular library to make my program function. So that's totally normal. And in Ubuntu, for instance, you have the apt tool, which is watching out for those dependencies and keeping track of them. Every major distribution has some sort of tool that does this, and it does a really good job. You would think that it's just the wild, wild west and everything is wide open and dependencies are going to break and the system's going to break. And the truth of the matter is that broken dependencies are very rare, and they usually come when you are trying to do something outside of the normal operating parameters of the distribution. Sometimes you will install a program even from the repositories and a dependency isn't met. It happens occasionally, but really not very often. And usually when you do run into those situations, they're pretty easy to fix. I just have to go get the package and install it. Boom, there you go. Something in the system didn't keep up with that, and you do it manually and the thing works. Now, as far as uninstalling Bracero, Epiphany, and Evolution, this would lead me to believe that he is referring to the GNOME desktop, and I have installed every one of those applications without breaking the system on the GNOME desktop. So let's take, for instance, Bracero, which is a disk burning program. if you uninstall that, you're probably going to see that a lot of dependencies are going to go with it. It's going to take a lot of stuff off the system because disk burning programs rely on all sorts of little sub-programs that take care of different functions. However, that doesn't mean the system is broken. What that means is that you're not running any disk burning software, so therefore you didn't need all that stuff and it went ahead and took it off the system. If you would go back to reinstall Bracero, or you would go and install a different disk burner like Xburn or even like K3B, then it would put all that stuff back. It would say, oh, I need that now, and it would go get it. Epiphany is a web browser. It is not, I don't believe there's anything in the GNOME desktop that relies so heavily on it that it would break anything. Evolution, on the other hand, I do know that in the GNOME desktop that the calendar function relies on Evolution. And so if you uninstall Evolution, the calendar breaks, but you can fix that by hooking it up to Google Calendar, or there are several other options. So if you absolutely positively just don't want Evolution on the system, you can fix that. And the thing about it is, truthfully, is that what I tell people is, okay, if you install Linux Mint, Ubuntu GNOME, or any desktop environment, leave it alone. Leave whatever's installed in place. It's not hurting anything, it's not bothering anything, it's not slowing down the system. And there are situations where you can break a dependency and all of a sudden something else doesn't work. And that's just the way this is designed. You could roll your own Linux. A lot of people do that, and they start out with like a base Arch install or even a base Ubuntu install, and then start building on it, and you could install exactly what you needed and nothing more. And yes, that's very efficient and there's no problem with it. And I went down that road a couple of years ago where I was playing around with trying to build up my own distribution, and I pretty much found out that it was more trouble than it was worth, because there's a lot of tweaking that goes on in a Linux distribution. A lot of stuff happens under the hood to make everything work together well. And while Linux programs are modular, and the entire desktop is modular, you can uninstall or install whatever you want on a Linux system, and it should all work together quite nicely. There are some tweaks that, let's say, Linux Mint does to get everything to work harmoniously that you wouldn't necessarily know about if you started out with base Ubuntu and then installed a Cinnamon desktop on it and started building it up, which is exactly what I did. I found out that these guys put a lot of effort into smoothing out all the bumps, so I'm going to trust them and let them create the desktop environment, and then I'm just going to use it. Now I can always add to the system. I can put, for instance, like in Linux Mint, the default music player is Banshee. Well, if you don't like Banshee, you can still install Rhythmbox or Clementine or any of the other music players out there that you want to. Just leave it in place. And Linux Mint is a pretty good example for that, because when you open up Linux Mint, you'll notice that you actually have 3 media players pre-installed. And you may look at that and go, why do they do that? But there are reasons for it. So you get VLC, you get Banshee, and then you get GNOME Videos, which is actually a program called Totem. And those 3 programs perform other functions within the operating system. So for instance, if you look and say, well, I don't need videos, so I'm going to uninstall that program, what you're going to find is that when you open up your file manager, your different thumbnails for your media, they're going to be gone because it's relying on that. And I don't know whether that's true in Linux Mint 18. I do know that it's true in older versions of the Cinnamon desktop. That may have changed. They may be using something different in the background. So if I'm wrong on that, don't crucify me in the comments. I'm just saying that as a for instance, that because when I was installing the Cinnamon desktop, I didn't get any thumbnails. And so I went up and did a little research, and I found out, oh, I need to have Totem installed. If I don't have Totem, then it won't be able to do it. Boom, there you go. That was a while back. Like I said, it might have changed. Same thing with the XFCE desktop. You need to have a dependency installed if you're building up XFCE. If you want to have nice thumbnails for videos, then what you need to do is install something called Tumblr, and it takes care of that for you. This is how Linux works. So if you download a Linux system, leave it alone. Don't do big major changes. I mean, you can change the themes and whatever you want to do, but rearrange the desktop. But as far as the installed software is, just let it go. And if you want to use something else, just download it. And then you can tell the system quite easily to make that the default player. Like, for instance, if you don't want Banshee to be your default player for music, then you switch over to Rhythmbox and just let it roll. Now, in the case of Rhythmbox and Banshee, you can uninstall Banshee. It's not going to hurt a thing. Banshee does not have any dependencies within the desktop at all. But just using it as an example. I like Banshee anyway. I just leave it alone. If I'm working on Ubuntu, I use Rhythmbox. And if I'm working on Linux Mint, I use Banshee. I just kind of use what's there. So I hope that answers some of the questions. And this is a really good example of somebody who's coming to Linux from Windows, and they just look at it and they go, wow, it appears to be a mess. But believe it or not, it actually works. I mean, it may seem that way, but it's actually a very stable and cohesive system. I've had Linux systems that I've installed and have been running for 4 years with no major problems, no broken dependencies, no kernel crashes, and nothing like that. So there you go. Hope that answers that question. This one is from M. Wilson. He says, "Hi Joe, as always, thanks for your awesome video. I know this is an older one, but I was revisiting it to get a refresher on rsync because he's referring to a video I did about making backups with grsync. I have a question. When you spoke about getting a new old stock hard drive for cheap, is there a particular place you shop for hardware that you can recommend?" Well, I'll tell you what I do. I go to Amazon.com because there are a lot of sellers on Amazon that have new old stock hardware for computers. And then the next choice, I guess, would be eBay, and you can look on there. Now, eBay's a little bit more iffy. Amazon, if you specifically need a new old stock thing, you're going to be able to find it, or a used thing. It seems to be a little bit more, I don't know, stable. Whereas on eBay, you don't quite know what you're getting sometimes. But those of you who have done this kind of know the deal. So I don't buy a whole lot, but that's where I look. And in this particular instance, in this video, I was talking about buying a new old stock hard drive. It was a 160 gigabyte Western Digital Caviar drive, and I needed it for a project machine I was working on, but didn't end up using it. So it ended up going into my desktop, and it works quite nicely, even though it's 10 years old. And it does exactly what I need it to do, and it's actually got low hours on at this point. So, you know, there you go. Got the whole thing for 15 bucks. It was awesome. So, yeah, you can buy all new stuff, but if you kind of know what you're looking for, if you don't mind buying something that's a little further back, you can find new old stock stuff like that, and bam, there you go. Good video, but there's a loose end flapping for me anyway. For the non-specified mount points, temp, USR, var, what partition are they written to? I'm guessing that the partition with the root mount point. Is that right? Yes, that's absolutely correct. And at this point, I want to talk a little bit about partitioning, just to clear up some things. I know a lot of folks are coming to Linux and they're not real hip to this, so I just want to jump over and talk about it a little bit. And I have prepared a visual aid, which is just a little file that shows the output from the ls block command for 3 of my machines. And each one of these machines has a different partitioning scheme. So this is for Rajco, and it is also for Carvin O here. Okay, when you install your Linux system, you are offered, if you do a manual install, several options for mounting different directories within the file system. And he listed var, USR, and var is for variable, USR is Unix system resources, and then he was also talking about the boot partition. We talked about that as well. The reason why this is all separated is because Linux is modeled after Unix. And while Linux came along in 1991, it uses the same partitioning schema as Unix does. And Unix has been around for a very, very long time, since the 1960s. And in those early machines, those big mainframes in the 70s and 80s, what you had were large arrays of small storage devices. Okay, so they just didn't have big hard drives that stored anything more than maybe I mean, if you had a 100 megabyte hard drive back in those days, that was huge, Jack. I mean, we're talking something the size of a refrigerator. So the system's file structure works in such a way that it always starts with the slash. The slash represents the start of the file system, and then off of that you have all of the different folders that you would have for your system. So let's say, for instance, let's just do this real quick and make that full screen too. And all I'm going to do is ls a, I know I want the long, and we'll just do the root partition. So this shows the file system on this system. There you go, right? So if you could theoretically set up a Linux system that each one of these directories, everything starting with a D here, is actually on a separate storage device. And so even today you are offered that ability to take like var and move it. So let's just do a short listing, make it a little bit easy. No, I want to do ls and I want to do that one. I'll clear the screen and do that again. So this is your root file system here. I'll make this a little bigger. So here's your root file system. Come on, work with me. Okay, so this is the root file system, and you'll see that we have bin and CD-ROM and Etsy and all this stuff. You can take all of this stuff and put it somewhere else. So it's not. Let me do that one more time. Make sure it's showing everything. ls. Just do an ls there. There we go. Now it's going to make sense. Duh. There we go. Thinking too fast is what the problem is. Okay, so here's our root file system. So what we could do here is, first of all, we could take boot. That could be in its own partition. We can also have a separate partition for var. Okay. We can do a separate partition for temp. We can do a separate partition for a lot of these things here. And in this particular installation on this machine, the only separated partition is home. Now you can't see that from looking at the file system because Linux doesn't care what file system, where it is. It doesn't care where the data actually is. So you can take a storage device. For instance, I could take a storage device, hook it up to the machine, and I can put it in the MNT directory. And then as far as the system is concerned, it's just part of the file system. There are no A's and B's and C's and D's and all that stuff. All right. So that allows you to have that functionality. And even today we are offered the ability to do that. But do you have to do that? Why, no, you absolutely don't. So what I've done here is to bring up some partitioning schemes that I use on my systems. And I don't, like I said, I don't separate the boot partition anymore. I did that for a while, but I don't now. So this is what I've got going on. So on a standard system with one hard drive on it, what I like to do is create the root partition first. And these are all primary partitions. And we're talking about MS-DOS here, not a UEFI system. And you're not using GPT, you're using the old MBR, MS-DOS, which most of you are using. If you do have UEFI in your machine, I always suggest turning it off instead of dealing with it. It can be a pain. But anyway, so a standard system that has one hard drive in it, then you would have the first partition being the root, and then you would have your swap space. Your swap space should always be the size of your memory plus just a little bit more, up to 8 gigabytes, and then after that it really doesn't matter how much swap space you allocate. So you could do like 2 gigs. Talk more about that in just a couple of moments. And then there is the home partition, and it is separate from the root partition. And that gives you a lot of different options that you can do. So your home partition, for instance, could very well be by itself off on, it could be in another partition on the same physical drive, or it could be on another drive altogether. And if you do that, then you're going to have options like being able to upgrade the system without affecting your data. You're going to be able to change Linux distributions while retaining all of your data in your home partition. You can do a lot of really groovy things that way. So I do like to set that aside. So that's the way it's set up on this machine. So if you have one hard drive anywhere from 250 gigabytes up to 4 terabytes or whatever. This is how I would set up the system right here. Just real simple, 3 partitions, all primary, no logical, rock and roll. Now, this is another computer that I have, and this is a slightly different machine. So in the case of this machine, it has SDA1 is a solid state drive, and SDB, or SDA is a solid state drive, SDB is a spinning drive. And what I have done is the first drive, SDA, has the entire Linux system on it, including the home directory. This is just the whole system on one partition. However, I separated the swap partition out and stuck that on SDB, which is a spinning drive. And then I have a storage space here on this that holds some extra files that's like offline storage because it doesn't mount automatically when the system boots up. So I could get away with putting the home folder here. So some of the stuff I don't use all the time, I stuck over here. It's perfectly okay partitioning scheme there. And then finally, if you are dealing with a really small hard drive, like an SSD, you have a system that has like anything below 250 gigabytes of space, then separating out anything becomes kind of counterproductive. It's just not the most efficient use of the space. Simply because of the fact that when you, okay, for instance, up here, this is a 320 gigabyte drive. I have set aside 16 gigabytes for the operating system. That would be this partition right here. And it's only taking up about 6 gigabytes of it now. So that leaves about 7 gigabytes of free space that cannot be used by this partition. So if this home partition gets really, really full, there's going to be 7 gigabytes of space that it cannot access because they are partitioned off. So if you're dealing with a really, really small drive, it becomes more efficient just to throw everything into one partition. So on this particular machine down here, which is actually a virtual machine, you'll see that I have a swap partition up front, and then I have SDA2 is the root partition, which contains everything in the file system. And in this case, the machine only has 1 gigabyte of memory, so I've given it a 2 gigabyte swap space. So let's talk a little bit about that real quick. I'm trying not to get too deep into this, but okay, how much swap space should you set aside? The answer is the amount of memory that is in the machine plus a little bit more, as long as you have a memory count somewhere between 2 gigabytes and 8 gigabytes. So at 2 gigabytes, 2 gigabyte swap space, 3 gigabytes, 3 gigabyte swap space, 4, on up. Now, once you get past 8 gigabytes, the system probably most likely is not going to use swap very often anyway. So you could reduce that size and you could make your swap partition like 2 gigabytes. But do not eliminate it entirely because that will cause instability in the system. Every kernel developer that I have read their writings or talked to, anybody who's really intimate with that side of the system says, yes, Linux needs some swap space. And so does Windows as well. There's got to have some place where you can use virtual memory, because if you don't have it and something goes crazy and starts sucking up memory, it's going to have some place to go. And also, there are certain programs on Linux and other operating systems as well that get direct access to that swap area. If you want the machine to hibernate, if you want the machine to sleep correctly, you're going to have some swap space, especially if you want it to hibernate. So if you're going to if you intend to hibernate a machine that has 16 gigabytes of memory in it, you need to give it 16 gigabytes of swap space. Now, if you're not going to hibernate it, most machines will sleep just fine with less swap space than memory. So in that case, if you have 8 gigabytes or more, you could like I said, create a 2 gigabyte swap partition. You'd be fine. Now on the low end of the scale, what if you have a machine with really low memory in it? Anything below 2 gigabytes, you need to create more swap space than memory. So for a 2 gigabyte machine, you could get away with 2 gigabytes of swap space. If it was a 1 gigabyte machine, then I would use 2 to 2.5 gigabytes of swap space. If you're running like 512 megabytes of memory, then 2.5 gigabytes of swap space. You really want to make sure that that machine is going to have a place to expand its memory if the physical RAM runs out. What Linux will do if it runs out of physical RAM is it will just simply crash. It'll just stop working. And so therefore that virtual memory becomes very important, because once the system starts swapping to virtual memory, you're going to know that's going on. It's going to slow down. And even if it fills up the physical memory and the virtual memory, the machine at some point will stop and warn you and go, hey, I am getting really close to running out of memory. Something's going crazy here. Fix it. So much better to have the swap space there. There are people that say, well, I got 32 gigabytes of RAM. I don't need any swap space. Yes, you do. You need a little bit. So anyway, that's a crash course in partitioning, talking about different partition schemes. If you are new to Linux and you're installing for the first time and you want the operating system to create the partitions for you as it installs, it'll do it. The installer will create it. What it usually does in that case is it takes SDA, which is the first drive on the system, and then it creates a great big root partition that holds the the slash partition that holds the OS and everything, and then it will create a swap partition that is a little bit bigger than the memory that you have, and it will stick it on the end of the drive, and it will make that a logical partition. So you'll actually look at it and it'll say SDA1 would be the root partition, then an SDA5 would be swap. And the reason why that it jumps up to 5 is that all logical partitions start at 5. So the partition number 5, 6, 7, 8. You can have as many logical partitions in there as you want to. Now that might confuse the hell out of some people because you're not really familiar with how the master boot record partitioning system works, and I'm sorry if it did. But in that case, if you're very confused, then just let the system partition it itself. It'll run fine. And then as you learn more about it, if you should happen to reinstall, then you can start separating your home partitions and all that stuff. Regardless of what you do partition-wise, always maintain external backups. So that's enough on that. I hope that was useful. Okay, so if you want Linux as my main, but need Windows for games, what would you recommend? Would a VM player be stable enough? And this is from Non-Responder01. Okay, this is a question that I get asked a lot because there are a lot of people out there who want to run Linux and have Windows around for other reasons. They're not ready to completely jump ship and they're not doing a switch. And for years and years, people have said, well, you can always dual boot. You can have Linux on one part of the partition, you can have Windows on another. I have covered this subject in depth. I do not recommend dual booting. I especially do not recommend dual booting Windows 10 and Linux anything. Windows 10 tends to wipe out Linux partitions with updates. There's all kinds of issues that arise from that. So another option that you can do if you only have one machine is that you could install a piece of software like VMware, or you could install something like VirtualBox, and then you could install Linux in a virtual machine or vice versa. I think what Non-Responder is talking about here is installing Linux and then trying to run Windows in a virtual machine. And if you're going to play games on that, I would not do that. Virtual machines, no matter what the hypervisor software is, simply do not have the ability to render games quick enough to make it worthwhile doing. So in his case, it'd probably be better to go the opposite. Leave Windows alone, install a Linux VM, and then start doing things in your Linux VM like email and stuff like that. And then you could strip the Windows installation. You could remove all the stuff that you didn't need and just use it as a hypervisor and a platform for playing games. You could do it that way. But actually, the best way to do this is to just get another machine. Hardware is cheap these days. I mean, you can buy a used computer for, I was just looking the other day, I found some really nice machines for $125 shipped. All right. And so therefore, you could get a second machine, load Linux on it. You could start using that for whatever you want to use Linux for, and then you could still keep your Windows machine to play your games. Or you could buy a new Windows machine, just keep it real stripped down, just put your games on it, that's all you're using it for, then take the old machine and then you could load Linux on that and make that your day-to-day daily driver for the things you want to use Linux for, and then just keep the other machine around for Windows. So yeah, there's a lot of options out there, but the one that I really don't recommend is dual booting. If you want to dual boot your machine, you go right ahead, you knock yourself out. I just think there's a lot of pitfalls with that. There's a lot of problems. It causes potential issues, and unless you are really, really, really familiar with exactly what's going on when your computer boots up, and you understand bootloaders, and you understand exactly how all that works, and you are prepared to repair it if it should break, then don't do it. If you are going to do it, great, and just be prepared to have a problem and be able to fix it. And if you don't know how to do it, or that scares you, don't do it. That's my attitude on dual booting. So anyway, there you go. It's the Q&A video, and I hope that answered some of your questions. And we will definitely be doing more of these as I get the pretty cool questions to talk about. And one of the things that I'm considering doing here very soon is I'm going to do a video about the Ext4 file system. Now, I don't know when I'm going to do that, but I'm going to get into how to manage it, some of the different things about it, because most people who are running Linux on their desktop are using the Ext4 file system. So I probably will get deeper into partitioning and that sort of thing in the future. So thank you for watching. Be sure to check out EzeeLinux on the web. Check out EzeeLinux on Facebook. And if you do check it out on Facebook, give it a like. Also, check out Freedom Penguin for lots of really cool articles about Linux from contributors such as myself. And those links will be in the description for this video. As always, your comments, suggestions, critiques, flaming, whatever, it's all welcome. And I look forward to hearing from you.